Hello, good morning. Welcome to part two of our conversation with Jayman. So, Jayman, in part one, we were talking about religion. That was the last point, and you were about to delve into the effects of the doctrine.
Yeah. So one of the side effects I was saying about how the ban on cousin marriage and broke down the clans, and then you have the manor system, which relied on mobile labor. One of the effects of breaking people away from their clans is that clan societies typically work that all the social arrangements are based on the family. Like you really are not trustful of outsiders. You're trust based on people who are blood relatives. Whereas in an individual society, like most Western European societies, you're able to the overall societal trust is higher because your life depends on cooperating with non-relatives. So the ability to cooperate with non-relatives eventually led to higher societal trust. People weren't so suspicious of non-relatives as they are in planet societies, which is the majority of the world. Um, this allowed a greater level of cooperation between people. Eventually, this leads um, to higher interest in uh, more freedom of individual thought, and a higher interest and a higher trust of people leads people to pursue things like intellectual endeavors like science.
Innovation,
uh,
and they collaborate more.
Exactly. The wickification of society, as HBD puts it. People are willing to publish their work and put out their discoveries and actually trust other people, and that's pretty much not to steal their ideas and all that. Open exchange of ideas, something that even in other sort of intellectual societies like China at the time was pretty much unknown. I mean, trade secrets are the rule in China, and that overall slows technological progress because you can't put, innovation is building on other people's work.
And the
So
churches built universities, and universities were autonomous bodies that could engage in free research. This is a major point.
yes, that right. All these things kind of snowball together. Like the nature of the church is downstream of the nature of society, and that in turn shapes the selective pressures which serve to push everything in a certain direction. And eventually, this gives rise to the Industrial Revolution, to the Scientific Revolution. You know, and you see Western Europeans go on to dominate the world.
Eclipse in the world.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's
Christianity in the West propelled human capital formation and innovation. So Edward Grant, the eminent historian Edward Grant, argues that during the medieval ages, to become a theologian, one had to be really brilliant. A degree in theology was a graduate degree. And usually, when people were discussing natural philosophy, what people in the medieval ages would refer to as science, that's what we call medieval science, natural philosophy. Back then, students were not required to invoke religion to explain natural events. So Edward Grant is arguing that the medieval university was not as mystical as how it has been promoted by some scholars. And what I also find interesting is that Edward Grant invoked an idea of some scholar debating the nature of angels. And I appreciate this example because it reveals the high level of logical development in the medieval age. So even though some people don't believe in angels, they don't think that angels exist. But if you're going to say that angels do not exist, that's insufficient. You have to debate the nature of angels and what they do and why they exist or why they might not exist. So there was the yes and no method. So medieval universities facilitated serious debates. So even if you were a religious person, one had to rely quite heavily on the deductive method to prove his claims. And I think that's a really good example.
Yeah, I mean, in general, as societies got more advanced, you see a trend towards secularism. Um, and this is certainly true in most Western Europe, but it's also true. I mean, the counterpoint, like in Eastern Europe and in East Asia, society has trended in a more secular direction, but they are more clannish societies, so that they lack the institutional sharing and institutional trust that led to technological development. But once exposed to the technology, they could adopt it, but they were less able to originate it themselves.
And the Protestant church promoted individualism. So this is the research of David Cantoni. The Protestant faith promoted human capital formation indirectly by placing a premium on the acquisition of individual knowledge, learning for one's own self-development.
Yes, I mean, a lot of these. I mean, religion in general is a reflection of society that creates it. That I mean, it represents the ideals of societies and culture, and it serves to enforce the norms of that society. So, really, religion, culture, religion as a part of culture is the society creates the culture, and the culture then creates a selective pressure, which shapes society, which then shapes the culture, and so on and so on. So um, you find that in Protestant societies, where an emphasis was on individual ability and individual uh, success, uh, these are things that foment capitalism and individual wealth and individual knowledge that lead to science and development and all these things. And um, this is why you have success you see in Northwestern Europe. Um, in a in a more in a more interesting thing, even within Northwestern Europe, some parts of it have been more successful than others. Certainly, the Protestant core surrounding the North Sea has been pound for pound more productive than the more peripheral parts that have been more Catholic, with the possible exception of the Alps. The Alpine area, like Switzerland, southern Germany, Austria, that part has been exception. I mean, to this day, remains successfully innovated, even though it's actually Catholic. Um, but in general, the more Protestant areas, it represents like a smooth gradient from the more individual societies you have there to the more clannish societies, like as you get to the point of southern Spain or southern Italy. I mean, even in Italy, there's a stark contrast between northern Italy, which has historically been a source of science, art, and development, and southern Italy, which, while pretty successful in exporting its culture, hasn't been as much of a strong intellectual contributor.
But remember, the Italian city states were Catholic. So I am not one of those people who share the view that the Roman Catholic doctrine is hostile to innovation. The Roman Catholic Church built the universities, the Renaissance, Catholic Italy, the humanist movement, Catholic Italy. But I do get your point.
Mhm.
Yeah, so Jayman, there is a striking parallel between our conversation about growth in Europe and the slavery. So there's this silly argument that slavery somehow propelled Europe. I write about it and I explain the intricacies of the argument to people who want to learn, but it's not an issue that I often discuss. Europe was able to exploit slavery and the slave trade due to human capital and institutions. So Robin Pearson and David Richardson, they have an article on social networks during the Industrial Revolution, and they also talk about the Atlantic trade. And there are other articles on social networks and the Liverpool trade. Trust was relatively high in Europe. Europeans also had a human capital advantage and a human capital advantage in shipbuilding, and Europeans had a business model. There was the Royal African Company, planters wrote manuals, societies existed both in the Caribbean and even the US South to promote agricultural research. Other places had slavery too on a large scale, but they failed to create a business model. And that's why for Africa, according to Jutterbolt, for Brazil and Colombia, basically everywhere, there is a negative relationship between slavery and economic growth, But people will say Europe had slavery, America had slavery, and these places are so rich. Well, they're rich because of their institutions and human capital.
Right. Then for those that don't know what we mean by human capital, we mean, um, you see, the general belief in today's Western society somehow that the society makes the man, and what we're saying is that it's actually the man that makes the society. That society is the way they are because the people that comprise it, not so much because the society's made the people have these abilities. And when we say human capital, we mean IQ,
Oh,
higher IQ
Jayman,
population.
I don't want to cut here, but quick point again. And I agree with Joel Monk here, the brilliant economic historian. Human capital is not just bookwork, it is the application of talent. So on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, there were other countries in Europe where people were smarter than in England. However, the British had human capital. They knew how to invent and to build and to commercialize. So human capital is not just book learning, it's the
Right.
execution
Right,
of
right. I mean,
talent.
right. I mean, it's a possession of raw talent, the ability of skills, and the ability to apply those things. Is that when a society, I mean, IQ and a certain combination of personality traits. And when a society has more of those people in them, they're going to be more prosperous than a society that has less of those people. And then to the point of slavery, to say that I mean, there's another common kind of myth going around that Northwestern European societies and derivatives like the United States and such are wealthy because of slavery. Well, I mean, sure, the U.S. and Britain and all those countries are relatively wealthy, but Spain isn't that rich.
And
Spain
Portugal,
had a lot of right. Spain and
that's
Portugal had a lot of. In fact, their societies, their colonies in the New World were more based on slavery than British colonies, and they're not that rich today. The Middle East, yeah, a lot of Middle Eastern countries are rich, but that's only since the oil boom. And they imported an enormous number of slaves into their societies, and they didn't develop any wealth until the oil was discovered. And indeed, in those countries today, human capital is pretty low.
yes,
They
relative to,
have,
to Western Europeans. But even more interesting is that according to people like Henry Kamen and other younger writers, the Spanish Empire was expensive. It was expensive and costly. Spain did not gain a profit when it invested in imperial building. It was costly for the Spanish. And John, I don't know if you're familiar with somebody called John Coatsworth, but John Coatsworth some years ago penned a paper and he was basically saying that Europeans had human capital, and what matters for growth is that people with the capital and the ability to invest and not necessarily you was basically saying that institutions are important, but they don't have to be inclusive. What they need to do is promote entrepreneurship and innovation. And he even gave examples of places not doing well because the Spanish Empire failed to suppress all the traditions.
well, I mean, using the Spanish colonies in general, I mean, part of the reason the Spanish empires, the Spanish and Portuguese empires were not as productive because they simply didn't have the human capital. To look at British colonies like New England, you know, by and large didn't have slavery, but they got by selling ice. Because New England has plenty of ice in the winter, and they would actually, just chop up ice blocks and sell them off to the Middle East and other places to get by. And they managed to get very wealthy on their inventions and their technology, all without slaves. They did that because they had high human capital, and this Iberian empires didn't have that. They basically just exported agricultural goods like sugar, but didn't have the ability to create any other things of value in their societies, at least not to the extent that the more northwestern European countries did. So I mean, even in the United States, historically, the North, which didn't have much by way of slavery, was wealthier and more developed than the
Yes,
South.
that's what Nathan Nunn said. So Nathan Nunn did the research on the American South, Jutta Bolt for Africa, Robinson for Colombia, and Palmer for Brazil. And what I find interesting about the paper on Brazil is that it dovetails with a paper by Paul Rode and Alan Homestead, saying that biological innovations drove productivity rather than the intensity of slave labor.
Yes, yes, that is exactly what happens. The slavery is more of a consequence of the ability to enslave people, essentially. And slavery is certainly not something unique to. I mean, in the Western societies, when we think of slavery, we often think of Africans being enslaved in the New World by Europeans. But I mean, slavery is something that's existed since humans could overpower other humans, and it's been a
It was
rule
in
for human
Africa, it was in
society.
Asia, it's everywhere.
Right.
There are
It,
books
it,
on there are books with titles like Slavery in Asia, in Asia and Africa,
yeah.
Slavery in the Muslim world.
I mean, you still have slavery in Africa today. I mean,
Yes,
it's something that's a human universal. And to say that that's the thing that is responsible, and usually what they mean is that's responsible for gaps you see between more northern countries and more southern countries in the New World, or the difference between Europe and Africa today. No, that couldn't really be the difference because slavery was a constant. It was something, well, not a constant, but it was something that was highly prevalent everywhere. Indeed, Europeans themselves were slaves because of the Barbary pirates would
yes.
raid southern Europe and bring slaves from Europe to Africa to be slaves, where the slaves would typically work to death. So, you know, that isn't the reason why a lot of countries are behind now. And even countries that did endure very adverse, or peoples that endured adverse societies, like the Japanese that immigrated to Brazil. I mean, in South America, you have a whole influx of people from all over the world, not just the Africans or Europeans or the descendants of the Amerindians that were there. You had um, in addition to Iberian Europeans, you had Germans, you had Italians come in, you had the Japanese came in, and the Japanese were poor farm servants. And today, the Japanese Brazilians are some of the wealthiest Brazilians you have.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. The Japanese in Brazil, the Germans in the Americas, immigrant human capital. But Jayman, there's this
Mm-hmm.
paper titled Slavery and the British Industrial Revolution, and its conclusion is overall our findings are consistent with the view that slavery accelerated Britain's industrial revolution. But I read the paper, I've been looking at it, and it's actually more complicated because the writers are saying that slave holding is linked to wealth rather than the slave trade. There was a link between the plantation economy and slavery. The plantation economy stimulated demand for manufactured goods. So therefore, without the human capital of people in Europe, that demand and that link would look less impressive today.
Yes.
Plantations in the plantation complex in the Caribbean was profitable. Slavery was profitable, but it's still misallocated labor. A business can be profitable yet inefficient. The
Yes.
plantation model in the Caribbean was quite profitable. It made millions.
Yes.
People in Britain became wealthy. But
Yes, they did.
that model was linked to entrepreneurship and productivity in Europe.
Yes. You need people to be
And
able to.
the value added component is really driven by the human capital of Europeans.
Yes, you need people to be able to exploit the the system you have in place in the first place.
So they're
And
right. Over by the 1830s, slavery wealth is strongly correlated with economic development. Slave-holding areas are less agricultural, closer to cotton mills, and have higher property value. Interesting observation, but again, this link is really about the productivity of people
yep.
because unproductive people don't know how to add value, or should I say maximize value. So you
Right.
can build a cotton mill and the cotton mill fails because of poor technology and poor management.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the slavery was indeed very profitable for the slaveholders, indeed. But if you didn't have a society that had human capital to develop technological innovations, to develop economic systems that could properly use and maximize this wealth, you're not really going to get anywhere. And in fact, even in Britain, slavery was outlawed in the early 1800s. And yet British society continued to prosper.
Just like the US South. The US South was productive even after slavery. You can read Gavin Wright. I have often stated that we need a transfer of human capital from rich countries to poor countries because foreign human capital is linked to growth. So German human capital in the Americas, even the human capital of the Portuguese in Brazil. Poor
Yeah.
countries need the human capital of rich countries.
You mean, but then someone might say neo-colonialism or something like that. I
But
mean,
no,
yeah,
colonialism has a bad reputation. That's quite unfortunate because I don't know if you have done so, but I've read tons of studies on the effects of colonialism, even the colonialism of the Mughal Empire and Western colonialism. The effects are actually mixed, and some studies are quite positive. So Easterly did a cost benefit analysis study, and his results are positive. There's another study by two writers saying that the longer the duration of colonial rule for an island, the richer the island. That study was criticized, and the writers penned another response. And even James Robinson, his studies are really mixed. Morality studies are mixed. So I don't endorse the view that ex-colonies are lagging because they were colonized. Many of them are actually better off due to colonialism because before colonialism, human capital was lower in these places. Even in the Americas, there's a paper by somebody called Jurg Barton. He wrote about the Incas, and he was basically saying that the Incas couldn't defeat Europeans because human capital was lower.
yeah. I mean, Greg Cochran wrote that when the American Amerindian empires were confronted with old world invaders, it's like they were facing invaders from the future because where they were in their technological development is where the old world was thousands of years earlier. Um, but I mean, yeah, that's exactly bringing in human capital from more wealthier places. That's how it's done in, like, say, the wealthy Middle Eastern states today, like
Yes,
places like United Arab Emirates, like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and all those things. They have all these marvels because they bring in engineers and developers from Europe generally to
exactly.
to actually build these things for them.
But Jayman, before one can progress, he must admit that he's not as smart. So the Europeans during the medieval ages were willing to learn from the Arabs. The Japanese during the Meiji Restoration wanted to become a Western country. For a country to progress, it must admit that that it is actually backward. But unfortunately today, modernity has a negative connotation, development has a negative connotation. So laggard countries perpetuate underdevelopment because that's the politically correct thing to do. A leader in a third world country can't get up today and say we need to modernize, we need to get richer, we need capitalism. That's not politically correct. But look at Rwanda. Why is Rwanda doing so well? Many reasons, but economic freedom is a big reason. You have to change society to
Yeah,
improve. You can't remain stagnant.
yeah. I think a lot of the developing world has actually been doing relatively well in that front. Like extreme poverty has greatly reduced in a lot of these countries, and a lot of that is due to foreign investment and presence of foreign human capital in these countries, and the technologies and abilities we export to them, and they also we a lot of these countries serve as manufacturing hubs for certain things like textiles that are used in the West are overwhelmingly made either in Latin America or South or Southeast Asia. So you know that's helped develop their societies to a great extent compared to where they
But
were just a few
I
decades ago.
agree, but they also need a mindset change.
Yeah, I mean,
A big we know of better data to guide our conversations on about culture. So mindset changes are important.
yeah, I mean, if you have the proper leadership in these places, you can sometimes get enormous progress. I think a lot of these countries have done. I mean, given what they have to work with, that they have done. Made great strides in the last few decades. Um, obviously more so in places like Latin America and the Middle East and South and Southeast Asia than say Sub-Saharan Africa, which still has a long way to go. One of the biggest positive developments in most of these countries is the reduction in the fertility rate. A lot of these countries are converging towards Western fertility levels, which for them is good, because these countries really don't have the resources to support runaway population growth. So it's kind of good that you have increasing levels of education and reducing fertility rates. And fertility rates are still coming down in the Sub-Saharan Africa, but they're still very high. So
Africa has a geographical problem, a leadership problem, and an IQ problem.
yeah, yeah, that is going to be one of the big challenges for the 21st century,
Yes.
Sub-Saharan Africa, because they are currently undergoing runaway population growth, and the population is exploding, and this is a low human capital population. So
Have
you
you
know,
been following the confirmations of Richard Lynn's study? So when Richard Lynn said that IQ scores were low in Africa, that inspired that inspired fire debates, and then David Becker responded. But no, Russell Warren has a paper, Sarah Goose has a paper. Sarah Goose doesn't directly reference Richard Lynn, but the argument is that IQ scores in Africa are actually low, and Lynn's figures are not looking as bad.
yeah, I mean, every investigation, I mean, Becker's I know very well. Every investigation to Richard Lynn's IQ scores in Sub-Saharan Africa, which are some of the lowest in the world, being an average of around 70, which for comparison in northwestern European countries, it's around 100. Um, some people find that those scores are unbelievably low, but they're not actually. That is about where average IQ is in these countries, and that explains the poor development that we see in sub-Saharan Africa. The human capital simply isn't there. Now, sub-Saharan Africa is one of those places where the environmental component of group differences IQ is important, because IQ scores are lower than they should be given genotypicability. I think a lot of that reflects poor nutrition.
And schooling, poor schooling.
I'm sorry, say again.
Poor schooling, poor school. That's a big
Yeah,
problem in Africa.
Poor nutrition, poor education, parasites and pathogens, which is a major problem in Africa. I think that
Malaria and the tsetse fly, big problem.
Yes, I think that there's definitely, and more so than most places in the world, there's definitely room for improvement in average IQ if you could address some of the environmental problems. Now, that would take you from 70 to probably 80 in terms of average. So it'd still be very low compared to Western standards, but it would still not be as abysmally low as we see it. It would lead to some more improvement versus where they are now.
Jayman, I live in Jamaica and you are of Jamaican descent. So let's use Jamaica as an example. Jamaica implemented an IMF program, a pro-market IMF program. Public sector reform, pension reform, and tax reform are the objective of this program. We have a second IMF program now. And Jamaican leaders, especially this present prime minister, he likes to talk about markets. But at the same time, he is committed to social justice. The administration also likes to flirt with feminism.
Oh,
and
really?
Because yes. So he said so yesterday he said that the Caribbean is a paragon of good gender policy. So he likes to flirt with feminism, and there's actually an intention to have gender quotas. The finance minister said so some years ago. So this administration likes to flirt with feminism. There's also flirtation with environmentalism and the renewable energy lobby, and a commitment to social justice. They love both parties. They love to talk about the poor.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see that the environmental component because I mean environmentalism is highly compatible with like say Rastafarianism in Jamaica, but I mean the feminist
Yes.
Jamaica's to think that Jamaica of all places is going for social justice, that's
Yes.
like wow.
No, no, no. Cancel culture is not a big deal, but it's growing because some time ago, a
Wow.
beauty queen, she was dressed like Annie Palmer, and the Annie Palmer story is untrue. But a lot of idiots don't know that the Annie Palmer story is untrue. So that
Uh,
led to a firestorm some years ago. And there are people who want a statue of Christopher Columbus to be removed, although it's on a private property. So
uh,
the cancel culture, identity politics nonsense is really swelling in Jamaica, slowly but surely.
wow. I might have to go back there at some point to see for myself because it's kind of
Yeah,
hard
yeah,
to
yeah,
believe.
yes. Slowly but surely it's swelling. So although the administration is interested in markets, its social policy is quite left, and then Jamaica is still a space where people view politicians as saviors. So they will get up and say, we want an apprenticeship program. The government should build it. Whereas in Europe and America, entrepreneurs build research institutes, universities, and apprenticeship programs. So if there is any problem, people talk about the MP, the politician. They want money for our
Yeah.
children to go to school. They solicit assistance from the politician. And it's a culture that doesn't seem, this culture does not seem to be dying slowly. So even though on the upside, people talk about markets, socially and culturally, the country is still in the doldrums. Like one lady, she said, Jamaica is not evolving. Jamaica is not evolving culturally. And I'm like, lady, Jamaica's cultural problems are not due to colonialism because she was blaming colonialism. And I was saying, Jamaicans are still soliciting native doctors. They're buying guard rings. These people are at a lower stage of psychosocial development. And this is not because of colonialism. In fact, it's more linked to African cultural retention. So some people want street names to be changed because of the colonial legacy. So I don't have much hope for that place.
Oh boy, it'd be very I mean, yes, I mean, so some social progress taking place in Jamaica would certainly be good,
Oh yeah, and
but
the
to
IQ
see
is
to
75.08. That's really low.
yeah, to see it to ever to think that some of the crazier aspects of Western social justice take root here, that would be a shame. I would have to say that. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the issues with Jamaica just simply stem from that the lack of human capital. The average IQ is in the mid to high 70s, and most of them are obviously
75.08, that's really low. And
yeah,
today, people in the private sector are basically saying, we
yeah.
have
I mean,
jobs, but we can't find people with human capital or people who are willing to work. So some people will show up to work on a site and then tomorrow you never see them again. The work
yeah.
ethic
I
is
mean,
poor.
yeah. I mean, now when we say human capital, I mean it's more than just IQ. I mean, IQ tends to be correlated with certain personality traits like conscientiousness, which tends to be lower in these societies. You know, the ability to just simply show up to work every day on time and do your job. You know, is something that's a lot lower in these developing countries. I mean, that's like a famous joke I've seen it said not so much about Jamaica, but it's equally applicable there. It's harder to do large projects if individual components are unreliable. Like there was one of the stories I was reading where Brazil specifically that if you do a construction project, you need the concrete guys to show up, the electricians to show up, and all these things, and you never know if they're all going to be there at a certain day or whatever, you know. So
Well, the natives are saying in Jamaica. I am a native, but I have been taking myself away for some time. But other natives, they have been saying it. Look, when the Chinese are building a project, an infrastructural project, it is expedited. So the natives
mhm.
are now learning for themselves. They are saying it, not me, them. But that's just the reality. And no politician has the moral fortitude to confront this culture. That's what's lacking.
Yeah, I mean that's a tough one because I'm not sure there's that much room to actually improve because considering what it has to work with, Jamaica's doing pretty well for itself.
Yeah, but you know
Um,
that's on the flip side. On the flip side, I often say to people, yes, you guys bash colonialism, but relative to many poor countries, we're still better off.
I mean, just look at Haiti.
Exactly. So I think these guys who like talk about colonialism and reparation, they should just pipe down.
I mean, Haiti is the great counterexample of that because Haiti had thrown off its colonial methods long before most other Western countries have, and it is one of the poorest countries in the New World. I mean, to the point that for many years, my mom had said about how when she visited Haiti when she was young, about how she couldn't believe how poor it was, and she came from a place that itself was pretty poor. So that should tell you what kind of poverty we're dealing with. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's good to hold up the ideal of progress and doing more for yourself, and it's good to try to look at Western or even Chinese development as being something to emulate and something to aspire to. But it also has to be done with the understanding that it's never actually going to be at Western levels. You
I
know, you're
agree.
you're never going. Jamaica is never going to be the United States. In terms of its development. Yeah,
Singapore could excel because East Asians they score higher on long-term orientation.
yeah.
So
I mean,
I
the
often say to people that East Asians might not be as individualistic and innovative as Westerners, but they score superior on long-term orientation. And long-term orientation predicts entrepreneurship and economic growth
yes,
and even innovation. And they
yeah,
save
Singapore.
more.
Yes, indeed. Like Singapore, the majority of the population is Chinese. I
Yes.
mean, they have Malaysian minority and some British that remain, but I mean, uh, it started from a high human capital population. Indeed, places like Singapore or Israel or Hong Kong or Taiwan, all those places serve, or South Korea for that matter, those places serve as examples. These places were all poor backwaters, but then they excelled rapidly.
Because those places had other bureaucracies and an education system. So there is radical Christopher Paik, and he's saying that people are arguing that Japanese colonialism was beneficial in South Korea, but the case is that the South Koreans already had a bureaucracy and institutions.
Oh, you see that's an interesting thing there, right? When everyone talks about the horrors of colonialism, how bad it was,
They love
uh,
Japan.
right? You look at Japan, and the countries that were colonized by Westerners may have not necessarily done so great, but the countries that were colonized by the Japanese seem to all do great now, and it can't be so much because of the Japanese were pretty brutal in their occupation, far more so than Europeans were.
Jayman, do you have more time for a third link?
Certainly.
Great. So I'm going to close this and do a third one.
All right.